Okay, now recording. I shall share my screen. Well, after that wonderful interlude, I am really pleased and proud to present the legend that is David Catherwood to the collection. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure, I hope.
Well, I'm sure it'll be a very interesting time of chat, and just to learn a little bit more about the history and if I get the light right, that's better. I mean, I've known your name for a very long time, and you're an extremely well-published gentleman across the board. But where do you come from? A musical family yourself? What's your background? Do you have a musical family?
No. I was the first one to be interested in music in my family. We grew up near the Army Hall, and so it was really the Salvation Army that brought out my interest in music. No one was interested in music at home, and this was something that I found particularly in the Salvation Army as a young boy.
Oh, very unusual. It's normally steeped in listening to the records. So what were your early exposures then? I mean, not having the music in the house, what kind of music did you grow up with? And when did you sort of first realise that music was something that you could take seriously rather than just, you know, the recording near the radio and whistling a tune?
Yeah. I think the first recollection that I've been told about, really, I say recollection, but something I've been told about, when I was in my sort of buggy and 2 or 3 year old, my mother used to wheel me down to the police band concerts, which were held every Friday at the City Hall in Belfast. And she tells me I used to sort of get in her knitting needle and conduct the band.
Didn't we all?
From my buggy. So, I suppose there was an interest there right from the start. But really, the main sort of live music I first heard or was aware of was the Salvation Army Band, because growing up just a few streets away from the Army Hall, on a Sunday morning, you'd be in bed, and at 10 o'clock, a sort of, in those days, a 40-piece band would march to your street, form up just outside your bedroom window, and start playing, all this sort of music, which to me, I'd never heard all this sort of rich harmony live, just in my own street. So I was really taken with this Salvation Army Band and their cornets and their trombones and their euphoniums. Didn't know the names of the instruments then, but it was fascinating just to wake up on a Sunday morning and hear that right there in your street. So that was. So
was the involvement a case of something that you grew into, and then you found out that composing was something that you could actually do? Or was it a case that you were composing and sort of mucking around with no real aspect for the brass band idiom, as it were?
Yeah, I suppose what happened, I said you sort of following the band back to the Army Hall and getting involved with the young people's corps there. We're talking now in 1960s, late 1960s, when I was maybe 10, and joining the YP band, being taught how to play, and then in the teenage years, wanting to just get people together of my own age and arrange music for them, write out music. So we would sort of take the tunes of the day, and I'd maybe say, well, we want to play this, so we'll need it for these 5 people, and that's a quick way to learn how to transpose. Suddenly you realize you write out the tune, and that doesn't work for an E flat horn, so you work out how to do it, and it was very a practical based approach to learning how to score for brass band. So I think that was my earliest attempts.
So who were the people that, I mean, there might not have been people, But are there any kind of names that you remember from your initial kind of rearranging that sort of helped your compositional skill? And when you went wrong and you didn't know something, why doesn't that work? Who are the people that you would say you encourage as your mentors in those days?
Yeah, well, I suppose we all had our leaders as such. So there were YP band leaders and band masters and so on to sort of to ask advice from. But I suppose the main person I got real advice from was when I was sort of late teens, and I sort of started to send a few things into the music editorial department, and Stedman Allen was exceptionally kind in sort of steering me in the right direction, and he was also very kind in not publishing some of my early efforts, because if I look back at the first things I sent in, which were, I suppose, turned down, they came back with suggestions for improvement. They came back with ideas of what I should have been doing and what I could have done. So those letters, sometimes a 2-page letter, from this sort of experienced composer to a teenager, and as I've grown up, I've heard this story repeated, from other people who Stedman Allen took an interest in. So I think that was my first feeling of, all right, I've got somebody who can show me the way to go.
Very interesting, because Ray Stedman Allen is just a legend in the brass band world, totally. So obviously in those days, I'm guessing it was a pen and paper job, but does it continue to be a pen and paper job and to sketch out the ideas and the formula and what you've got? Because nowadays we've got computer software and apps and everything that can do all the hard work, but has your process evolved over this, or do you still prefer start off with a sketch and then go? How does it work for you?
Yeah, funny, I was doing a similar thing like this just last week with Ken Downey and Bill Himes and Dorothy Gates, and we all were of the opinion that computers are a great tool for musical notation, but not so much for musical composition. So I would really say pencil and paper, start there, have it on 2 or 3 staves so that you can see what's going on, and only when you've got it pretty much formulated in the harmony and the melody and the counterpoint on a piece of manuscript paper, that's the only point I would go to the computer just to sort of play the notes into the computer. And really the computer is there to help me make a nice legible score and save time in writing out the parts. You got to remember, when I started doing this, when you'd written the score out, this is talking about the late 1970s, early 1980s, you had to write the score out, and then every single part had to be copied out from the score. So that process, it seems so long ago since I've done that. You sort of forget how time-consuming that was. But the computer's great for that. So that's the use of the computer.
Yeah. Who were the sort of the first guinea pigs to your first compositions then, when they started coming through, and you could make it a serious piece that people outside of your immediate family and core comrades and core music sections, did you have anybody in mind? Was it the local YP band that would try out the early hymn tune arrangements and so forth?
Yeah, I was quite lucky in the core that if I wrote a piece for the band, I think the bandmaster at the time, David McGuckin, again, we've taken a great interest in me as a young Salvationist musician, and anytime I would come to him with a piece of music, I've written this, yes, we would try it out with the band. Even, I think my earliest band trip, I'm trying to think now, maybe 1974, the year might not be exactly right, but certainly the early 1970s, and our band went to Wood Green, and I'd written a piece. Looking back now, it probably wasn't that great of a piece, but it was put on the Sunday afternoon program, and it's since been forgotten about. But for me, that was a big thing as maybe a sort of 18, 17-year-old young bandsman, to have a piece played on a Sunday afternoon program in what to me then was a big London core.
Yeah. So, do you remember the first time you were asked to conduct a band?
Oh,
particularly in one of your own pieces. I mean, it's easy to get up there and do conduct the band in Repton or St Denio, but can you actually remember? Is it that big a thing that you can actually remember? Someone said you wrote it, you conduct it.
Yeah, well, I suppose I was again lucky in that. As I said, David McGugan was the bandmaster in the 1970s, and he, when I think back on it, he must have had great faith, because at the age of 17, I was made deputy bandmaster. So,
very good.
Yeah. So, to me, it didn't seem a big thing then, but looking back, and you certainly, when we're looking for leaders in the corps, nowadays, probably the 17-year-olds aren't the first people we think of, but maybe they should be. Maybe we sort of don't give credit, to the sort of what some young people can do, and certainly I was encouraged when I was a teenager. As I was deputy bandmaster from 17 to 23, and then commissioned bandmaster at 23, and did that for 10 years. So
yeah. So So when you're doing these arrangements, and obviously since then you've progressed and matured in your music, when you're doing a hymn tune arrangement or you're doing a setting, how do you and yourself maintain the originality? Because as you say, you've got the Ray Stedmans, the Ken Downeys, and the Jim Kernos and the Bill Himeses, who can just sort of turn on a tap and there's a St Andrew St Denio. How do you approach the writing of a new setting for yourself to keep the original, to keep it original, so you're not duplicating or copying, whether intentionally or unintentionally?
Yeah, I think that actually touches on another aspect that certainly I would consider myself more of an arranger than a composer. Yeah, I do compose music, but I arrange much more music, and I've arranged many tunes and so on for the army. So as an arranger, I suppose I could maybe give an example of one tune that was asked for when Derek Kane was making his lyric variation CD. Yeah. He wanted an arrangement of a Scottish tune to reflect his heritage, and so he asked me would I arrange Annie Laurie.
I was listening to it earlier. It's a lovely tune.
Yeah, Dearest Name, in Earth and Heaven. So you looking at that tune, it's such a well-known tune, and as an arranger, I feel you've got to add something to it. You've got to keep the essence of the tune and do something with it which sort of value adds in an artistic way, that adds something to the tune that is unique to you, and so on. So with that particular arrangement, I think the first thing that I thought of was a little rocking figure that, if you listen to the recording, it starts off with basses and horns, and it's just a little rocking figure which goes on for two or four bars, can't remember, and then that continues on underneath the tune as little musical ostinato, and the tune sort of comes in and sits on top of that, and you to me, that is the sort of the essence of the arrangement. It's that idea which is my idea, but which fits with the tune in a way which I feel enhances the tune. It lets the tune sing, and it just provides a nice cushion of sound for the tune to be played on top of. So those are the sort of things I look for, and also little motifs that can maybe drawn from the tune. So you might get the in Annie Laurie, the octave is an important interval, so that might come into play in your accompaniments and so on. So yeah, just look for things within the tune that you can bring out and have this artistic value added idea that the other thing is to disguise the mechanics of it from the listener. The listener doesn't want to be aware of all of this.
Yeah.
The listener wants to enjoy the piece of music. But I think as craftsmen, we can do that. And if our craft is right and well honed, then it becomes evident to the listener, not in a direct way, but maybe subconsciously they feel that the arrangement is somehow right or correct, or just, yeah.
So how do you approach the writing of it? Do you have to lock yourself away and switch off the radio? I mean, what's the process? Do you play the piano at all, or is it a case of, just literally go with a pencil and paper and then tidy it up? What's your approach, whether it's an arrangement or an original composition that you're doing yourself?
Yeah, I suppose I'm a night person, and I would tend to get my best work done from, say, 10 o'clock at night to, say, 2 in the morning. And
oh dear, sounds interesting.
But having said that, you get less interruptions after midnight, and it's uninterrupted time, and I find that's the best way to work. And if I've got an ordinary piano which I would use, but if it's that late at night, I've also got a digital piano that's got headphones, so that's that way as well. So.
Oh, that's interesting. I love it, because it's just that some people they have to lock themselves away, switch off the radio, and tell the family, "Don't disturb me. I've got to do this solo. It's important." So So looking at your list for composition, I remember one of the first things that I was aware of with your name, I think, was When I Remember, which really used that wonderful, what he's done for me. It's like that chorus that everybody in Sunday school always sang, but no one knew where it came from. But I think the one thing I've learned from interviewing all these composers is that the date of publication doesn't reflect the date of composition at all. So your first brass composition I can trace is Songs of Childhood in 1979, which is, I couldn't find a recording of that, but the first one I could find was Come Home, which is 1981. But you seem to have a real knack for doing solos. You have a lot of solos published, which whether it's euphonium, trombone, or a cornet solo, you seem to be the go-to guy for a good solo.
Yeah, so a couple of stories relevant to that. Firstly, the solos come from the fact that I work best when I'm asked to do something, and most people ask for solos. So you mentioned When I Remember, and a bit of an interesting story behind that one, in the sense that two people thought they had it was written for them. Things have been sorted out now, but the original request came from Gordon Ward, New York staff.
Okay, yes.
And Gordon asked for a cornet solo, and I came up with When I Remember. And around about the time I gave it to Gordon, David Dawes said, "Oh, don't fancy doing a solo, or have you got any solos?" And I don't think I said too much about it, but I sent him When I Remember, and I think he thought I'd written it for him, and had maybe told that story to a few people. But we've ironed it out now, and we did establish that the solo was written for Gordon Ward, but of course taken up also by David Dawes and recorded on his solo album with the ISB as well. So. That was the background to that solo, and just some of those pieces you mentioned from 1981 and 1979. So
Come Home.
Yeah, so I suppose when people see a name at the top of a page in 1979, they think of a sort of older composer and so on. So I remember one occasion when I arrived at a music camp in Canada. I think it may have been Alberta, so out west in Canada, and been introduced to the other members on the faculty, and one of the bandsmen came up to me and said, "Oh, are you David Catherwood who wrote?" And I think he mentioned the piece from 1979, Songs of Childhood. Mm-hmm. And you've got to remember that this was like sort of 2000 and something. And I said, "Oh, yeah, that was me." And he said, "Oh, I thought you'd be dead by now." So,
lovely.
Yeah, so I suppose he thought of me in 1979 as being in my 50s or 60s.
Actually, I don't know why. I mean, I suppose you get some names that just, I don't know, feel old, and then you meet. I mean, I remember we had a piece on the stands, and I was asked to do some overheads for a festival, and I thought, well, I'll get the, it wasn't a solo. I'll get the composer's name, and I found a. And he was a fairly young man from Canada. I don't know can't remember who the guy was. And the bandmaster went, "Crikey, I thought he was an old man in retirement with a name like that." And yet he was a man in his early 30s. I never got in touch with him again. So it does happen. By sheer coincidence, I found that most composers tell me that they love writing functional music because it's music that is going to get used. And you can write a grand suite or a selection, but if it's written for a big Albert Hall commissioning event, it's only it's tailored for that particular event. Whereas if you're writing a solo or an arrangement that's very sort of Triumph series in nature, then more bands are going to be able to access it, and it's sort of fulfills the task. Is that something you're aware of when you're obviously if someone commissions you to write a solo, the person and the skill set that you're writing it for. But is it just because people have asked you to write solos, or is that an idiom that you feel particularly comfortable in doing?
I think the first answer is probably the most obvious one, in that if people ask to write a solo, then they will almost invariably play it. So that's a good point. I think every solo I've written for people like Gordon Ward and Derek Kane, the two main people who would ask for solos, I think every solo that was written for them, they played and recorded with either the ISB or the New York Star Band. So I've been very lucky, in that regard, that people have asked for solos. And another nice thing is they came back for more. Gordon Ward, I wrote When I Remember for him, and then another solo I wrote for the European tour was a solo called Blessings, which they recorded on, I think it was the Pressing Onward CD. And another solo which was written for Gordon was called Forward. So a little play on his name, for Gordon Ward. So Forward. So there's 3 solos written for him, and as I say, the nice thing was that he came back twice for another solo. And same with Derek Kane. I think the first solo I wrote for Derek was I can't think of the name of it now. It was a quick one, 1980s.
You found All I Have I Am Bringing to Thee, which is 1986.
No, not that. No, the one after that.
Spirit of Life.
Yeah, that was written for Derek. Yeah, and then another quicker one, which I still can't remember the name of.
We know it will come. People can look it up. It's out there. It's written, and that's the important part.
And then he asked for Annie Laurie. So at that stage, I think I'd written 2 solos for Derek, and then 3 solos, and then for his ISB, or I think the Forte, 40th anniversary of the Staff Band, he asked me to write an arrangement of his song Divine Right, which was then recorded by the ISB and Derek on his Forte album. So I think that's 4 solos that I'd written for Derek throughout the years, and they've all been recorded and used. So that's an important thing for them to be used.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because when I was looking through your list, the one oddity that sort of was the reverse of the normal. Is I could only find one march published, which was
Yeah.
Royal Royal, which I
Yeah.
actually found a recording of. So I was actually able to listen to the. Is it just a fluke that it's just the one published? I mean, do you have others that are, sticking out the filing cabinet, or is this something you've never been asked to do again?
Yeah, well, maybe that comes from my first rejection, which I think the first piece I ever sent in to the music editorial department was a march called "The Evangelist." Now, having said that, eagle-eyed viewers will notice that Ray Stedman Allen did write a march called "The Evangelist" later on. So I suppose the kindest thing I can say, he maybe thought the title was good, but didn't think the march was so good. So he sent the march back, and he told me in a nice way. I think one of the things he said about was there's enough material here for 2 marches. Because in says I just did this and then went on to the next thing and then the next thing and then the next thing and then the next thing. Not thinking of, well, maybe we could go back and repeat a bit or something. So he sent the march back, and that was my sort of first rejection, and also maybe it put me off marches.
Oh, shame, because Porter Royal Royal is a good march. I mean, the inclusion of the hymn tune in it is a very kind of organic thing. It's not like you stop the march, plump the hymn tune in, and then begin the march again. It's all very intertwined in the actual tune. And I think it's Belfast Temple Band on YouTube have done a recording of it. So it was really nice to be able to find the solo march, because most other composers do it the other way around.
Well, the funny story behind that was that was recorded on St. Patrick's Day last year, and our corps officer said, "Oh, could we have an Irish march?" And I said, "Well, I don't think there are really
Irish march."
Yeah,
that's an interesting idea.
So we were trying to come up with an Irish march, and then I happened to say, "Oh, well, I've written one. I'm Irish, and I've written a march. It's called Portora Royal." Portora Royal, of course, is a school in Fermanagh where we held the Irish divisional or the Belfast Temple music camps back in the 1980s, and so that the march Portora Royal was written for the camps back then, and the tune "Praise My Soul, the King of Heaven" is included in that march because Henry Francis Light, who wrote the hymn "Praise My Soul, the King of Heaven," was a pupil at that school, and his name in the entrance hall. And so it just sort of jumped out at me. Oh, Henry Francis Light, "Praise My Soul," there's the tune for the march. So
it's a very interesting piece of music. I think the other thing that caught me was Rhapsody for Trombone. Because it's published in 1992, but I'm not someone who does a lot of trombone rhapsodies. They tend to be sort of Rhapsody for Euphonium or Cornet. But it was an interesting listen, and it definitely had some interesting motifs in it. But do you remember whether that was a commission or whether that was just something you wanted to write? What is trombone an instrument you're good at writing for? Because it sounded very comfortable. It goes back to what you were saying about the listener not wanting to learn about the mechanics, but enjoying the piece. And it was a very kind of settling experience.
Yeah, it was written actually quite a few years before that, maybe a decade before it was published. And it was written because I'd been invited to do a band weekend at Boscombe Corps.
Okay, yeah.
I suppose this is in 1980. 80 something, and I'd just been appointed bandmaster of Belfast Temple. I played the trombone, or I still do play the trombone, but I suppose I was invited both as a composer and a trombone soloist, but I never really have been much of a trombone soloist. So I figured that the best way out of this situation was to write myself a trombone solo. And I would only write things that I could play. So it was written for a trip to Boscombe, and sort of first performed with Boscombe Band, and probably not too much performed since, because it was it was written sort
I
of
think
just
it's
for
lovely though. But
yeah.
I mean, you're not exclusively a brass band composer though. I mean, you do have several vocal compositions. I've got Spirit Alive, Victory, Moved by Love, Gift Wrap, Love. Does that require a different kind of concentration from the brass idiom? Because obviously writing vocal is different to writing brass. So how do you approach the vocal side of the work?
Yeah, I think overall I've written more vocal music than I have brass, and if you go outside of the army, I'd be more known as a vocal composer, because I've many works that are published outside of the army for choirs, and both church choral market and schools, a lot of music for schools and educational stuff. So vocal music has always been a big part of my things as a composer. And I suppose, getting back to the composing and arranging thing, in brass music, I'm more of an arranger. And in choral music, I'd say I'm more to composing. So more original music in the songs than in the brass pieces.
Is that something that, as a composer, you have? Is there a distinction between writing for outside groups and writing for a Salvation Army band or a Salvation Army or a musical vocal group within them? Because obviously we're not strictly limited to the traditional songster sound. We can have male voice choirs and octets and all the rest of it. So as a composer arranger, what's the difference? Is there a difference for you between Salvation Army music, whether it's brass or choir, and outside orchestration and choirs and all that kind of thing?
I suppose one of the differences in the church music part of things is that what I discovered early on was that in the army you've got the different series. You've got Sing to the Lord, there's SATB mainly, and below that you've really only got children's music. I can't remember the title of it now, but the sing company music. Whereas out in the church market, there's more of a graded system. A lot of music for SAB and whole series of music. So publishers would ask for a piece specifically for SAB, which sort of shows the lack of tenors and basses in church music groups. So it's soprano, alto, and baritone. So just three parts. A lot of that, which would be maybe easier music, and also very much a whole graded system from very difficult music and then right down to very easy music. And publishers would guide you through that and maybe say, oh, I need a specific level 4 piece or a level 3 piece, or whatever, and you maybe gear your writing more towards that. So maybe a different approach to the music in the church setting, and certainly in the vast majority of churches, maybe not as much, dare I say, talent that you would maybe find in an army corps. Obviously, at the high end of the church thing, in the cathedrals and so on, fantastic level. But in the sort of general, ordinary, run-of-the-mill church, maybe not so many in the choir, and maybe looking for a slightly lower expectation from what they're going to be doing.
Right. Looking at the heritage of Salvation Army music, from as a composer and arranger, when you were getting your stuff published, so you had the availability of scores that you had access to as deputy bandmaster and bandmaster and that kind of thing. Who were the names that sort of really inspired you as a maturing composer arranger in the early days when you were the deputy bandmaster, that, you know, if you had a score by a certain composer, it was a delight to be able to sit through it and talk. Who are the names that spring to mind as really inspiring for you?
Yeah, well, I think there are three, two groups of three, if you like, in sort of the UK. There would have been Eric Ball, Leslie Condon, and Ray Steadman Allen. Yeah, so those three, and then maybe linked with Eric Ball, but on the other side of the Atlantic, Eric Leidson. So Eric Leidson, but then the three in the 1970s, the three names that I grew up with and just couldn't wait to hear the next piece: Bill Himes, Steve Boone, and James Kernow. And those were the 6 or 7 names that I would look to first for programming, for inspiration. Eric Ball, Leidson, sort of right back to the old wells or whatever, up to his latest things that were maybe still coming out in the 70s. And then watching out from the latest thing from Bill Himes, whether it was To the Chief Musician or Motivation or Milestone, the Steve Bullas, the Cleansing Power, the trombones, all the special bone stuff, and James Kernow, Sound Praise, and all those fantastic American sound. To me, there was a distinctive American sound, which was different from Steadman Allen and Les Condon and Eric Ball, and in some ways more exciting to a sort of a young teenager listening.
Absolutely, yes.
You now looking back, Eric Ball and Les Condon, more of a sort of classical feel to it, more of a elegance, and with the Americans, maybe a bit more razzmatazz. And but having said that, if you go down deeper into those scores of Stephen Bulla and James Kernow and Himes, they do have the depth as well. So that yes, there's a superficial gloss on the top of American razzmatazz, but still got the depth, and that's what's
kept have the concrete base to begin with. So you can't launch a firework out of thin air. But, I think I would, when I was looking at the list, I've said this before, that it's always a pleasure to find a piece of music that I've been listening to for a while. Is that who wrote it? And I think I was watching a commissioning several years ago, and the Nick Simmons-Smith was conducting the Southern Territorial Band, and they finished with your arrangement of Michael Rowe. Now that seems to be almost out of kilter with you, because it's almost got a swingy sensation, where with your music it feels like that nice lilting sensation and that kind of gentle pushing of the soloist, rather than let the fireworks off. But was that something that you just thought you'd have a stab at, that kind of thing, or is it just something that's not been published a lot from the Catherwood live?
Yeah, well, Michael Rowe's interesting in that it probably got published maybe 20 years after it was written. Things
2013 that's got a publishing date.
Yeah, sometimes things sit around for a while, but it was written early 1990s for a music camp setting in Florida.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, and so it was written for music camp, and a lot of these music camps are built near the water and so on. And I think Jacksonville for one of the festivals, and it was a lovely town right there in the waterfront in Florida, and so a thing with a nautical theme sort of seemed to suggest itself. And Michael rowed the boat ashore, and I was sinking, and will your anchor hold, and so on. So all those nautical themes came in a little sort of swingy thing that I thought would be attractive to the average music camp band. So that's where that came from. Yeah. Well, what year was it published?
It's the publication date of 2013 in the Triumph series.
2013?
Yeah. According to the database. So.
Yeah, it's probably written in 1995. So,
as you say, the composition date doesn't bear any relation to the the publication date. One thing I did notice, it's not too many on the publishing side, but I I'm looking at you. You've got Normandy Carol arrangement of When Wise Men Came Seeking, All Were Looking for a King, and yeah, the festival series, festivals arrangement, they were all looking for a king. Yeah, Christmas music can be something that's so prolific. It can be very hard to bring a fresh twang to a recognisable carol. So I'd like to ask your approach to Christmas music. How do you try and keep it original and fresh while still retaining some of the most loved and most played tunes in the Salvation Army repertoire?
That's a tricky one, Christmas music. I haven't written that much Christmas music for band, really. I think it was just that flugelhorn solo, They All Were Looking for a King, which published in the American Band Journal. And I can't think of any other.
Oh, yes, it was. I'm looking at the wrong colour. Yes. Yes, it's got USL. I was looking at SPNS and wondering why it didn't make sense.
Yeah. So the American Band Journal is a great vehicle for particularly for smaller bands and ensembles, but good discipline to try and write for the American Band Journal. Any young composers watching, I would urge them to try writing for the American Band Journal, because it's a good steep learning curve. The editor is Dorothy Gates, who is from my home corps. Dorothy.
I've spoken to Dorothy. She's a very lovely lady.
Yeah, well, Dorothy was in my YP band many years ago. And Dorothy's now the editor of the American Band Journal. So, and of course they do a Christmas.
Yes, they do.
A Christmas journal as well. And I think of an arrangement in there of Mary, Do You Know, for a few years ago.
2014.
Yeah. So Christmas music. It's sort of like almost like a two-edged sword, in that if you get it right, it can be really helpful and successful. If you get it wrong, it can go badly wrong. I remember I was director of music at a college in Belfast for over 20 years, and every year we had to put on a carol service, and it was very traditional, sort of 9 lessons in carols, based on the King's College Cambridge format. And we always finished up with Hark the Herald Angels Sing, and always Will Come All Ye Faithful before that. We always started with Once in Royal David City. And I remember sort of taking this on, and for a few years we did that. And I thought, well, maybe people would like to hear some different carols. Big mistake. And so I one year when we sort of tried to sort of ring the changes and have just not necessarily obscure carols, but just something maybe a little bit different. And of course, after the event, where was this and where was that? Why didn't you play this? Why didn't we sing that? So I thought, okay, that's the last of innovation at Christmas. So you things could go badly wrong at Christmas. People have got expectations, and I suppose the trick is fulfilling their expectations, but somehow also introducing new elements as well. And that's a very delicate balance to try and get that exactly right. So Christmas is, I wouldn't say as a musician, it was never my favorite time of the year. Between
I wouldn't say I'm overly fond of it. I'm happy to do it, but there are some carol services I've been to in the past when I wish I hadn't.
Well, I remember when I was involved with the choir in the college, and involved with the Salvation Army band and so on, and we got to the sort of the final carol service, Christmas Eve, whatever it was, and somebody said, that was lovely, and I said, yeah, okay, it's the 24th of December, it's my 21st carol service since the 1st of December. Christmas for a musician can sometimes be not so
slog. Yes.
fun.
I had that a couple of years ago where I got to about the 10th and 12th of December and I'd done about 4 carol services, and a very wise Salvationist said to me just one comment which really put it into perspective. He said, just remember that may be the only time in the year they hear that carol. And he said, you've got to play it as if it's brand new to the audience, because they may not ever hear that again for the entire year. I thought, some of these people, that may be the only carol service they get to, particularly if it's an old people's home or you're just playing on the street and they can't get out. And, I play with the Ipswich Citadel Band on a Saturday morning, and it's regularly 4 or 5 Saturdays, through the caroling season. And we have various ways of keeping it fresh for ourselves, because we could literally play half a dozen Christmas carols in a loop, and you'd get so bored of it. I think you start making mistakes and you start ad-libbing and playing it wrong, and people would notice when you play it wrong. So it's very interesting to hear that. So bearing in mind that we've been in lockdown, part of the reason for this series of talks, has that meant that the arranging and composing has been sort of pushed to one side because other things have taken priority? Or have you had the time to sit down and finish off a few commissions and get some things started? What's been the process for you over the last few weeks from a music writing, arranging point of view?
Yeah, well, I suppose one of the last projects I was involved in before lockdown was written a musical based on C.S. Lewis's early days. From C.S. Lewis lost his mother at the age of 10, and then went to 6 different schools before he was 18, and we wrote a musical telling this story called Jack's Journey. Jack was his nickname. C.S. Lewis's nickname was Jack. We wrote this story called Jack's Journey, which was written for schools and had maybe 7 songs and some incidental music. And it was put on last November. And then just before lockdown started, we then...
Sorry, there's an emergency helicopter flying overhead. So
okay.
Yeah,
I was going to say, it must have been a very boring story.
No, it's just very unusual to have an emergency helicopter flying that low.
Well,
yes. I apologise for the interruption.
You can cut that little bit out and maybe just join on again. So, once lockdown started, one of the things I'm trying to do is expand this musical that was just based on a sort of for schools, and just 7 songs telling the early part of C.S. Lewis's life, and maybe try and expand that into a more full-length musical. So that's my sort of project.
Sounds fascinating. And I mean, we don't normally associate a lot of stuff with C.S. Lewis. We kind of get the Narnia and the literary side of him, but the early part is not something I think we hear much about. So
of course, C.S. Lewis is from Belfast as well. He's a Belfast boy. So did you know that? Oh yeah. So C.S. Lewis.
Things I don't know.
Yeah, born in Belfast, but spent all of his working life, firstly at Oxford and then secondly in Cambridge. So,
is there a particular piece of your music that you get the most comments about? Whether people send you an email or you get a text or whatever saying we played this piece of music at Sunday morning. Is there a particular title that sort of comes back at you again and again?
Yeah, probably the one that's been used the most and played the most is Spirit of Life, because it started off as a songster piece, and then it was written as a euphonium solo, and then it became male voice item in the male voice series, and finally when Johnny Corrie was bandmaster of Enfield, he requested a version for Enfield band to sort of play at their prayer time, and so it became a hymn tune arrangement. So that particular song, Spirit of Life, has probably over a long number of years sort of been coming back in different guises. And I suppose the thing I like about that, I said it right at the start, I feel more like an arranger than a composer. But Spirit of Life is the one euphonium solo I've written, which is all my music. It's my original tune. It's my euphonium solo on my original tune. So I suppose in that sense, I can take ownership of the whole thing. And I suppose that's the one piece that if I had to come back to as being most commented on, that would be it.
Yeah. Is there a piece of music that comes back to haunt you and sort of, oh yeah, that piece, yes, again?
Yeah. Not sure. I think if I was to sort of listen to some of the versions of When I Remember on YouTube, there's maybe some versions that could maybe have been aborted at some point.
But it's interesting because it's one of my favourite songs, but it's really because the tune's involved, and I played it last year, and I think we played the Stem and Allen version of the march, and it's that cornet solo. That's where it comes from. So
the march Alderney. The march is Alderney, which is in the old Green Tram series book, which I remember playing at.
No, Alderney is Dean Goffin, isn't it?
No, maybe not Alderney. Sorry,
it's another march. I played it in an last year, so I've got the bit.
Southdown. Same book.
Yes. Yes, I remember that because I had the good thought we were playing it at an open air, and the local vicar came in and the mayor came in, and we were all on drums, playing bass drums and cymbals on it. So someone recorded it for me. I've got the video somewhere. Southdown.
Right.
I'll ask this question in two parts. No, let me ask a nice question. How do you get your new music, particularly for Salvation Army bands, outside of commissions? Who are the guinea pigs that get the first trial and the look at new compositions, new arrangements from the Catherwood compositional bench?
Oh, well, I suppose I'm lucky enough to be on my second go round as bandmaster at Belfast Temple. So I was bandmaster there from 1979 until 89. So I did 10 years, mostly right through the 1980s. But just over 2 years ago, in fact, the bandmaster, Jack Birch, who took over from me in 1989, did just about 30 years in charge of the band. And then when he retired 2 years ago, I took the band on again for my second go round. So, but I don't think it'll be as long doing it this time as it was the first, maybe. But I said I'd do it for 2 years, and that was 2 years ago. So
they're the people that get the look at the new the new printouts from your printer then.
Yeah. I try not to do too much of that because they would get a bit fed up if I kept putting all my music.
Okay, I'll ask a couple more questions and I'll pray for you. Favorite Salvation Army Songbook song at the moment? Because I know it can change on a daily basis for some people, but what would you say at the moment? So, woke up 6 o'clock this morning, had your cup of tea. What would be the favourite Salvation Army Songbook song that's, in the brain and working around the grey cells?
Well, that's a tricky one. A tune that, or a song that I've used quite a bit, and it's actually on YouTube. There's a version of Derek Kane and David Dawes doing it at our band weekend, which was last September. A tune called "Now I Belong to Jesus," and the thing about that is it's such a marvelous message. But we planned this band weekend with Derek Kane as a special guest, and as it happens, David Dawes happened to be in Belfast that weekend and was in the morning meeting. And so we'd rehearsed all these pieces, for the band weekend. But at the end of the Sunday morning meeting, David and Derek arranged to play just impromptu a version of Now I Belong to Jesus. And it was unrehearsed, and it was put on YouTube, and it became almost the highlight of the whole weekend.
These things happen, don't they?
And it's got tens of thousands of views since then.
One more later on. I'll have to dig it out and have a look.
Yeah. So Derek and David playing that, and so that's a nice tune that I like.
Do you have a favourite song, contemporary Christian song outside of the Salvation Army that is a particular fondness for you?
Yeah. Anytime we've used "In Christ Alone," it's not a Salvation Army song, but a very powerful song. And I suppose once you get into the final few verses, there's really so much depth of meaning in the words that as a leader, as a band leader, it's lovely to get caught up in that whole sense of emotion that's in that song. So yeah, in Christ Alone, I think is a powerful song, and I need to check this, but I think that's written by another Belfast songwriter. Check that one.
Couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's lovely. Do you have a favourite passage of scripture that means a lot to you? Whether it's one verse or a selection of verses?
Yeah, I suppose in all thy ways acknowledge him, and he will direct thy paths. You think that's one that's been with me. Ever since the days that when we used to go and do open air meetings. I don't know if they had the same idea in England, but you'd have an open air meeting and they have a thing called gospel shots, and each bandsman would give out their favorite verse, and quite a few of the bandsmen had their verses written in their caps. So the cap would come off, and the verse would be read out. But you right from those days, it maybe started off as an easy verse to remember. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he will direct thy paths. But it's sort of moved on from there, from being an easy verse to remember to being something that is actually very true, and something that it's very important to remember in your life. That if you put God first and acknowledge him first, then you will find a way, and there will be a path for you, and he will direct that path. And you certainly, I found, we were just discussing this a few weeks ago, that even disappointments that come your way can, when you look back, I was talking to some younger bandsmen and saying they may have things that disappoint them in their lives, but every disappointment I've had in my life, when I look back, it's been the right thing for me at that time. And to sort of take this conversation right back to the start of the thing, it was probably a disappointment when Ray Stedman Allen sent back my march, The Evangelist, a disappointment. But if I look at that march now, and if I think if that had been published, now I wouldn't want it to be published because there's so many things wrong with it. And so the disappointment then helped strengthen me as a writer. And so I suppose that what I'm trying to say to the younger people is, don't let the disappointments in life put you off. They're really stronger.
It's a very powerful verse. I've said the story before that we were at the first ever funeral that I ever attended anywhere was my aunt's, my mum's sister, and we were at Arlington Cemetery in America. Yeah. And my uncle was a sergeant in the local Army Guard, local Marine Guard at the time, so he had a certain military funeral. and this very prestigious Marine guard came over to the cortege and said, you know, is there any Bible reference from the family? And most of us were so kind of out of it from jet lag that we couldn't think of it. And Mum just sort of said, well, I have one verse that keeps with me. And he said, well, could you please repeat it for me? In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he will direct thy path. And I think she repeated about 2 or 3 times to this poor young man in the pouring rain. And in the middle of the service, it was a flawless delivery. And you wouldn't have known that he literally had maybe 10 minutes to memorize it in all the scheme of all the funeral and everything. So it's a very powerful verse, and very apt, I think, for nowadays, that we have to acknowledge him, and, you know, we have to trust him. And I think that's one thing that's been shown in all these interviews that you yourself are an example of, is trusting God, and he will direct thy path. I'm going to say thank you so much for your time, your generosity, for talking about your music, your mentors. And it's just been wonderful to hear the stories and to hear your faithfulness and your inspiration, your passion for Christ, and all the ways that it moves in your life, whether it be through writing solos, or the failures. You don't let that hold you back, and you want to attack it, and you're not afraid to try something new. And I think there'll be a lot of composers, younger composers. I don't like using the word younger because it makes, make me feel like an old man of 90, and I'm not. And neither are you. Very, very distinguished composer with many years left in front of you. But I'm going to say thank you very much for your time. I'm going to pray for you, and then we'll bring this to an end. But as you wish, wave your hands around, put your head down, whatever is comfortable for you. But I'm just going to say a prayer for you and your family at this time to end this interview. Dear Lord, I just thank you for David. I thank you for his willingness to follow you. I thank you that you have endowed him with this ability to be able to compose music, whether it's an arrangement or rearranging a familiar tune by someone else, or original music for a specific need, Lord. I thank you, Lord, that he's been aware of this from an early age, and that he has not let stumbling blocks get in his way and given up. He has known that you've been there to prod him on, to keep him going. We thank you for that encouragement. We thank you for his gift of composition, his Christianity, his dedication to his banding, to music making, to arranging, to being able to find out that folk tune, that hymn tune, and just arrange it in a way that works for people. We think of people like Derek Kane and Gordon Ward and David Dawes, who are just supreme soloists, and we thank you that they've come to people like David to be able to ask for these music, knowing that it will be suitably used and be crafted in a way that will bring blessing, and that it won't be over the heads of people. We thank you that David is very much aware that if people don't understand what's going on, they'll switch off, and it's a loss of music to you, Lord. Nothing we do for you is ever wasted, Lord, and you take it and you bless it, and sometimes we have no idea how that blessing will manifest itself. So I thank you, Lord, for David's ministry over the years, for his music, for his leadership with music groups, Salvation Army bands, outside groups that he's been involved in, and for those groups that he continues to be involved in. I pray your strength and your guidance and the power of the Holy Spirit will continue to guide him, encourage him, and help him. And also for those younger composers and perhaps those composers who've just retired or are using this period to think about life and to maybe just pick up a pen or that Sibelius gift that's been given to them and start composing themselves. And they'll be looking at David and they'll be learning from his immense skill and dedication and his Christian witness in his music, in his life and his outlook, knowing that you're at the center of it. So I just pray for that, Lord. I pray for the people he comes into contact with, the people in the next few days and weeks that will be encountering him and he will cross paths with and be able to just share ministry and message and fellowship, maybe even just a cup of coffee and a cup of tea, Lord. but we thank you, Lord, for that sense of spirit and blessing that is within him. I just pray for him now, Lord, his musical ability, his compositional ability. I thank him for his time this evening. I pray for his family and his friends as they all struggle to try to keep going in this very troubled time. And I just thank him that he has a very profound knowledge of you, Lord. And I thank you, Lord, for the life and continued music that is David Catherwood. And I just ask your blessing upon him and his family right now, Lord, in this time. Amen.
Thank you.
Okay.